Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. In 1918, as World War I was raging in Europe, and the tragedy of the Spanish flu epidemic was beginning to sweep across the world, the writer Grace Livingston Hill published her 33rd book. The Enchanted Barn is a story about a charming, courageous, and forthright girl named Shirley Hollister. Brave and resourceful Shirley reminds me a little bit of Nancy Drew, even though Nancy wouldn't appear on the literary scene for another 12 years. When we meet Shirley, she is dreadfully worried about where her family will live. The small, dark, rented rooms they now occupy will shortly be torn down to make room for a large apartment building, and it is absolutely necessary that they find somewhere else to rent. Shirley is the oldest of 5 children, and with her father recently deceased and her mother too sick to get out of bed, the burden of finding a new place to live has fallen squarely on her shoulders. But they're so poor that even with all her efforts, they can't afford more than $15 a month for rent. Then, an unexpected half-holiday gives Shirley a chance to gather her thoughts together and think about a possible solution to their dilemma. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 1. Shirley Hollister pushed back the hair from her hot forehead, pressed her hands wearily over tired eyes, then dropped her fingers again to the typewriter keys, and flew on with the letter she was writing. There was no one else in the inner office where she sat. Mr. Barnard, the senior member of the firm, whose stenographer she was, had stepped into the outer office for a moment with the telegram which he had just received. His absence gave Shirley a moment's respite from that feeling that she must keep strained up to meet his gaze, and not let trouble show in her eyes, though a great lump was choking in her throat, and the tears stung her hot eyelids, and insisted on blurring her vision now and then. But it was only for an instant that she gave way. Her fingers flew on with their work, for this was an important letter, and Mr. Barnard wanted it to go in the next mail. As she wrote, a vision of her mother's white face appeared to her between the lines, the mother weak and white with tears on her cheeks and that despairing look in her eyes. Mother hadn't been able to get up for a week. It seemed as if the cares of life were getting almost too much for her, and the warm spring days made the little brick house in the narrow street a stifling place to stay. There was only one small window in Mother's room, opening against a brick wall, for they had had to rent the front room with its 2 windows. But poor as it was, the little brick house had been home, and now they were not to have that long. Notice had been served that they must vacate in 4 weeks, for the house, in fact, the whole row of houses in which it was situated, had been sold, and it was to be pulled down to make way for a big apartment house that was to be put up. Where they were going and what they were going to do now was the great problem that throbbed on Shirley's weary brain night and day, that kept her from sleeping and eating, that choked in her throat when she tried to speak to Mr. Barnard, that stared from her feverish eyes as she looked at the sunshine on the street, or tried to work in the busy monotony of the office. They had been in the little house nearly a year, ever since Father died. It had taken all they could scrape together to pay the funeral expenses, and now, with her salary, and the roomers' rent, and what George got as cash boy in a department store, they were just barely able to get along. There was not a cent over for sickness or trouble, and nothing to move with, even if they had anywhere to move, or any time to hunt for a place. Shirley knew from her experience in hunting for the present house that it was going to be next to impossible for them to find any habitable place for as little rent as they were now paying. And how could they pay more? She was only a beginner, and her salary was small. There were 3 others in the family, not yet wage earners. The problem was tremendous. Could it be that Carol, only 14 years old, must stop school and go to work somewhere to earn a pittance also? Carol was slender and pale, and needed fresh air and nourishing food. Carol was too young to bear burdens yet. Besides, who would be housekeeper and take care of Mother if Carol had to go to work? It was different with George. He was a boy, strong and sturdy. He had his school in the department store, and was getting on well with his studies. George would be all right. He belonged to a baseball team, too, and got plenty of chance for exercise. But Carol was frail. There was no denying it. Harley was a boisterous 9-year-old, always on the street these days when he wasn't in school. And who could blame him? For the narrow, dark brick house was no place for a lively boy. But the burden and anxiety for him were heavy on his sister's heart, who had taken over bodily all the worries of her mother. Then there was the baby Doris, with her big, pathetic eyes, and her round cheeks and loving ways. Doris, too, had to be shut in the dark little house with the summer heat coming on, and no one with time enough or strength enough to take her to the park. Doris was only 4. Oh, it was terrible, terrible, and Shirley could do nothing but sit there and click those keys and earn her poor little inadequate salary. Some day, of course, she would get more, but some day might be too late. She shuddered as the terrible thought flashed through her mind, then went on with her work again. She must shake off this state of mind and give attention to her duty, or she would lose even this opportunity to help her dear ones. The door of the outer office opened, and Mr. Barnard entered. "Miss Hollister," he said hurriedly, "if you have those letters ready, I'll sign them at once. We've just had word that Mr. Baker of the firm died last night in Chicago, and I must go on at once. The office will be closed for the rest of the day. You can let those other matters that I spoke of go until tomorrow, and you may have the day off. I shall not be at the office at the usual hour tomorrow morning, but you can come in and look after the mail. I will leave further instructions with Mr. Clegg. You can mail those letters as you go down." 10 minutes later, Shirley stood on the street below in the warm spring sunshine, and gazed about her half-dazed. It seemed a travesty on her poor little life just now to have a holiday, and no way to make it count for the dear ones at home. How should she use it anyway? Should she go home and help Carol, or should she go out and see whether she could find a house somewhere that they could possibly afford to move to? That, of course, was the sensible thing to do. Yet she had no idea where to go. But they did not expect her home at this time of day. Perhaps it was as well that she should use this time and find out something without worrying her mother. At least, she would have time to think undisturbed. She grasped her little package of lunch that she had brought from home with her, and looked about her helplessly. In her little thin purse was the dime she always carried with her to pay her car fare, in case something happened that she had to ride either way, though she seldom rode, even in a storm. But her mother insisted on the dime. She said it was not safe to go without any money at all. This dime was her capital wherewith to hunt a house. Perhaps the day had been given her by a kind heavenly Father to go on her search. She would try to use it to the best of her ability. She lifted her bewildered heart in a feeble petition for light and help in her difficult problem. And then she went and stood on the corner of the street where many trolley cars were passing and repassing. Which one should she take, and where should she go? The 10 cents must cover all her riding, and she must save half of it for her return. She studied the names on the cars. Glenside Road, one read. What had she heard about that? Ah, that it was the longest ride one could take for 5 cents within the limits of the city's roads. Her heart leapt up at the word. It sounded restful anyway, and would give her time to think. It wasn't likely, if it went near any glens, that there would be any houses within her means on its way, but possibly it passed some as it went through the city, and she could take notice of the streets and numbers, and get out on her return trip to investigate if there proved to be anything promising, or, if it were too far away from home for her to walk back from it, she could come another time in the evening with George, some night when he did not have school. Anyhow, the ride would rest her and give her a chance to think what she ought to do, and one car was as good as another for that. Her resolve was taken, and she stepped out and signaled it. There were not many people in the car. It was not an hour when people rode out to the suburbs. 2 workmen with rolls of wallpaper slung in burlap bags, a woman and a little girl. That was all. Shirley settled back in her seat and leaned her head against the window sash wearily. She felt so tired, body and soul, that she would have been glad to sleep and forget for a little while, only that there was need for her to be up and doing. Her room had been oppressively warm the night before, and Doris, who slept with her, had rolled from one side of the bed to the other, making sleep well nigh impossible for the older sister. She felt bruised and bleeding in her very soul, and longed for rest. The car was passing through the thickest of the city's business thoroughfare, and the noise and confusion whirled about her ears like some fiendish, monotonous music that set the time for the mad dance of the world. One danced to it whether one would or not, and danced on to one's death. Around the city hall the car passed, and on up Market Street. They passed a great fruit store, and the waft of air that entered the open windows came laden with the scent of overripe bananas, late oranges and lemons. A moment later, with sickening fumes, it blended into a deadly smell of gas from a yawning hole in the pavement, and mingled with the sweat of the workers grouped about it, picks in hand. It seemed as though all the smells in creation were met and congregated in that street within 4 or 5 blocks, and one by one they tortured her. Leather and paint and metal and soap, rank cheese in a fellow traveller's market basket, thick stifling smoke from a street engine that was champing up the gravel they fed to it to make a new patch of paving, the stench from the cattle yards as they passed the railroad and stockyards, the dank odor of the river as they crossed the bridge, and then an oilcloth factory just beyond. The faint, sweet breath of early daffodils and violets from an occasional street vendor stood no chance at all with these, and all the air seemed sickening and dreadful to the girl as she rested wearily against the window with closed eyes and tried to think. They slipped at last into the subway with a whir and a swish, where the cool, clean smell of the cement seemed gradually to rise and drown the memory of the upper world, and came refreshingly in at the windows. Shirley had a passing thought, wondering whether it would be like that in the grave, all restful and sweet and quiet and clean, with the noisy, heartless world roaring overhead. Then they came up suddenly out of the subway with a kind of triumphant leap and shout of brakes and wheels, into the light and sunshine above, and a new world. For here were broad streets, clean pavements, ample houses, well-trimmed lawns, quiet people walking in comfort, bits of flower boxes on the windowsills, filled with pansies and hyacinths, and the air was sweet and clean. The difference made Shirley sit up and look about her, and the contrast reminded her of the heaven that would be beyond the grave. It was just because she was so tired and disheartened that her thoughts took this solemn form. But now her heart sank again, for she was in the world of plenty far beyond her means, and there was no place for such as she. Not in either direction could she see any little side streets with tiny houses that would rent for $15 a month. There were such in this city, she knew, but they were scarce and were gobbled up as soon as vacant. But here all was spaciousness, and even the side streets had 3 stories and smug porches with tidy rockers and bay windows. She looked at the great plate-glass windows with their cobwebby lace draperies, and thought what it would be if she were able to take her mother and the children to such a home as one of those. Why, if she could afford that, George could go to college, and Doris wear a little velvet coat with rosebuds on her bonnet, like the child on the sidewalk with her nurse and her doll carriage. But a thing like that could never come to her. There were no rich old uncles to leave them a fortune. She was not bright and gifted to invent some wonderful toy, or write a book, or paint a picture that would bring the fortune. And no one would ever come her way with a fortune to marry her. Those things happened only in storybooks, and she was not a storybook girl. She was just a practical, everyday, hard-working girl with a fairly good complexion, good blue eyes, and a firm chin. She could work hard and was willing, but she could not bear anxiety. It was eating into her soul, and she could feel a kind of mental paralysis stealing over her from it, benumbing her faculties hour by hour. The car glided on, and the houses grew less stately and farther apart. They were not so pretentious now, but they were still substantial and comfortable, with more ground and an air of having been there always, with no room for newcomers. Now and then would come a nucleus of shops, and an old tavern with a group of new groceries, and crying competition of green stamps and blue stamps and yellow stamps posted alluringly in their windows. Here, busy, hurried people would swarm, and children ran and shouted. But every house they passed seemed full to overflowing, and there was nowhere any place that seemed to say, "Here you may come and find room." And now the car left the paved and built-up streets, and wandered out between the open fields, where trees arched lavishly overhead, and little new green things lifted up unfrighted heads and dared to grow in the sunshine. A new smell, the smell of rich earth and young green growing things, of skunk cabbage in bloom in the swamps, of budding willows and sassafras, roused her senses. The hum of a bee on its way to find the first honey drops came to her ears, sweet, droning, restful, with the call of a wild bird in the distance, and all the air balmy with the joy of spring. Ah, this was a new world. This indeed was heaven. What a contrast to the office, and the little narrow stifling brick house where their mother lay, and Doris cut strings of paper dolls from an old newspaper, and sighed to go out into the park. What a contrast! Truly this was heaven, if she could but stay and all the dear ones come. She had spent summers in the country, of course, and she knew and loved nature. But it had been 5 years since she had been free to get outside the city limits for more than a day, and then not far. It seemed to her now that she had never sensed the beauty of the country as today, perhaps because she had never needed it as much as now. The road went smoothly straight ahead, with now a rounding curve, and then another long stretch of perfect road. Men were ploughing in the fields on one side, and on the other lay the emerald velvet of a field of spring wheat. More people had got into the car as it left the city. Plain, substantial men, nice, pleasant women. But Shirley did not notice them. She was watching the changing landscape and thinking her dismal, pitiful thoughts. Thinking, too, that she had spent her money, or would have when she returned, with nothing to show for it, and her conscience condemned her. They were coming now to a wide, old-fashioned barn of stone, with ample, grassy, stone-coped entrance, rising like a stately carpeted stairway from the barnyard. It was resting on the top of a green knoll, and a great elm tree arched over it protectingly. A tiny stream purled below at one side, and the ground sloped gradually off at the other. Shirley was not noticing the place much, except as it was a part of the landscape, until she heard the conductor talking to the man across the aisle about it. "Good barn," he was saying reflectively. "Pity to have it standing idle so long, but they'll never rent it without a house, and they won't build. It belongs to the old man's estate, and it can't be divided until the youngest boy's of age. 4 or 5 years yet. The house burned down 2 years ago. Some tramps set it afire. No, nobody was living in it at the time. The last renter didn't make the farm pay. Too fur from the railroad, I guess. And there ain't anybody near enough round to use the barn since Hallier built his own new barn." And he indicated a great red structure down the road on the other side. "Hallier used to use this. Rented it for less'n nothin'. But he got too lazy to come this fur, and he sold off half his farm for a dairy, and built that there barn. So now I suppose that barn'll stand idle and run to waste till that kid comes of age. And there's a boom up this way, and it's sold. Pity about it, though. It's a good barn. Wished I had it up to my place. I could fill it." "Make a good location for a house," said the other man, looking intently at the big stone pile. "Been a fine barn in its time. Old man must have had a pile of chink when he built it. Who'd you say owned it?" "Graham. Walter Graham. Big firm down near the city hall. Guess you know him. Got all kinds of money. Got a regular palace out Arden way for summer, and a townhouse in the swellest neighborhood, and own land all over. Old man inherited it from his father and 3 uncles. They don't even scarcely know they got this barn, I reckon. It ain't very stylish out this way just yet. Be a big boom here some day. Nice location," said the passenger. "Not yet a while," said the conductor sagely. "Railroad station's too far. Wait till they get a station out Allister Avenue. Then you can talk. Till then it'll stay as it is, I reckon. There's a spring down behind the barn, the best water in the country. I used to get a drink every day when the switch was up here. I missed it a lot when they moved the switch to the top of the hill. Water's cold as ice and clear as crystal. Can't be beat this side of the soda fountain. I sometimes stop the car on a hot summer day now and run and get a drink. It's great." The men talked on, but Shirley heard no more. Her eyes were intent on the barn as they passed it. The great, beautiful, wide, comfortable-looking barn. What a wonderful house it would make. She almost longed to be a cow to enter this peaceful shelter and feel at home for a little while. The car went on and left the big barn in the distance, but Shirley kept thinking, going over almost unconsciously all the men had said about it. Walter Graham. Where had she seen that name? Oh, of course, in the Ward Trust Building. The whole 4th floor. Leather goods of some sort, perhaps. She couldn't just remember. Yet she was sure of the name. The man had said the barn rented for almost nothing. What could that mean, translated in terms of dollars? Would the $15 a month that they were now paying for the little brick house cover it? But there would be the car fare for herself and George. Walking that distance twice a day, or even once, would be impossible. 10 cents a day, 60 cents a week, twice 60 cents. If they lived out of the city, they couldn't afford to pay but $12 a month. They would never rent that barn for that, of course. It was so big and grand-looking, and yet it was a barn. What did barns rent for anyway? And if it could be had, could they live in a barn? What were barns like anyway inside? Did they have floors or only stalls and mud? There had been but 2 tiny windows visible in the front. How did they get light inside? But then it couldn't be much darker than the brick house, no matter what it was. Perhaps there was a skylight, and hay, pleasant hay to lie down on and rest. Anyhow, if they could only manage to get out there for the summer somehow, they could bear some discomforts just to sit under that great tree and look up at the sky. To think of Doris playing under that tree and Mother sitting under it sewing. Mother could get well out there in that fresh air, and Doris would get rosy cheeks again. There would not likely be a school about for Carol, but that would not hurt her for the summer anyway, and maybe by fall they could find a little house. Perhaps she would get a raise in the fall, if they could only get somewhere to go now. But yet, a barn! Live in a barn? What would Mother say? Would she feel that it was a disgrace? Would she call it one of Shirley's wild schemes? Well, but what were they going to do? They must live somewhere, unless they were destined to die homeless. The car droned on through the open country, coming now and then to settlements of prosperous houses, some of them small, but no empty ones seemed to beckon her. Indeed, they looked too high-priced to make her even look twice at them. Besides, her heart was left behind with that barn, that great, beautiful barn, with the tinkling brook beside it, and the arching tree, and the gentle green slope. At last the car stopped in a commonplace little town in front of a red-brick church, and everybody got up and went out. The conductor disappeared too, and the motorman leaned back on his brake and looked at her significantly. "End of the line, lady," he said with a grin, as if she were dreaming and had not taken notice of her surroundings. "Oh," said Shirley, rousing up and looking bewilderedly about her. "Well, you go back, don't you?" "Yes, go back in 15 minutes, said the motorman indulgently. There was something appealing in the sadness of this girl's eyes that made him think of his little girl at home. "Do you go back just the same way?" she asked, with sudden alarm. She did want to see that barn again, and to get its exact location, so that she could come back to it some day if possible. "Yes, we go back just the same way," nodded the motorman. Shirley sat back in her seat again contented, and resumed her thoughts. The motorman took up his dinner pail, sat down on a high stool with his back to her, and began to eat. It was a good time now for her to eat her little lunch, but she was not hungry. However, she would be if she did not eat it, of course, and there would be no other time when people would not be around. She put her hand into her shabby coat pocket for her handkerchief, and her fingers came into contact with something small and hard and round. For a moment she thought it was a button that had been off her cuff for several days, but no, she remembered sewing that on that very morning. Then she drew the little object out, and behold, it was a 5-cent piece. Yes, of course, she remembered now. It was the nickel she put in her pocket last night when she went for the extra loaf of bread and found the store closed. She had made Johnny cake instead, and supper had been late. But the nickel had stayed in her coat pocket forgotten. And now suddenly a big temptation descended upon her to spend that nickel in car fare, riding to the barn and getting out for another closer look at it, and then taking the next car on into the city. Was it wild and foolish? Was it not perhaps actually wrong to spend the nickel that way, when they needed it so much at home, and had so little. A crazy idea, for how could a barn ever be their shelter? She thought so hard about it that she forgot to eat her lunch until the motorman slammed the cover down on his tin pail and put the high stool away. The conductor, too, was coming out of a tiny frame house, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand and calling to his wife, who stood in the doorway and told him about an errand she wanted him to do for her in the city. Shirley's cheeks grew red with excitement, for the nickel was burning in her hand, and she knew in her heart that she was going to spend it getting off that car near the barn. She would eat her lunch under the tree by the brook. How exciting that would be! At least it would be something to tell the children about at night. Or no, they would think her crazy and selfish, perhaps, to waste a whole day and 15 cents on herself. Still, it was not on herself. It was really for them. If they could only see that beautiful spot. When she handed her nickel to the conductor, she felt almost guilty, and it seemed as if he could see her intention in her eyes. But she told herself that she was not sure she was going to get off at all. She could decide as she came near the place. She would have to get off either before she got there or after she had passed, and walk back. The conductor would think it strange if a young girl got off the car in the country in front of an empty barn. How would she manage it? There had been houses on the way, not far from the barn. What was the name the conductor had mentioned of the man who had built another barn? She might get off at his house, but still, what was that avenue where they had said the railroad would come some day with a station? They had called it out as they stopped to let off the woman and the little girl. Allister Avenue. That was it. She would ask the conductor to let her off at Allister Avenue. She watched the way intently, and as they neared the place where Allister Avenue ought to be, her heart pounded so that she felt quite conscious, as if she was going to steal a barn and carry it home in her coat pocket. She managed to signal the car to stop quite quietly, however, and stepped down to the pavement, as if it were her regular stopping place. She was aware of the curious gaze of both motorman and conductor, but she held her head up and walked a few steps up Allister Avenue until the car had whirred on out of sight. Then she turned anxiously, looking down the road, and there, to her joy, saw the stone gable of the great barn high on its knoll in the distance. Chapter 2. Shirley walked down the dusty road by the side of the car track, elation and excitement in her breast. What an adventure! To be walking alone in this strange, beautiful spring country, and nobody to interfere. She had paid her extra nickel to have a right to it for a little while. Perhaps her mother would have been worried at her being alone in the country, but Shirley had no fears. Young people seldom have fears. She walked down the road with a free step and a bright light in her eyes. She had to see that barn somehow. She just had to. She was almost breathless when she reached the bottom of the hill at last and stood in front of the great barn. The up car passed her just as she got there, and the people looked out at her apathetically as they would at any country girl. She stood still a moment and watched the car up the hill and out of sight, then picked her way across the track and entered the field where the fence was broken down, walking up the long grassy slope to the front of the barn, and standing still at the top in front of the big double doors, so grim and forbidding. The barn was bigger than it looked in the distance. She felt very small, yet her soul rejoiced in its bigness. Oh, to have plenty of room for once! She put her nose close to the big doors and tried to find a crack to look through. But the doors were tight and fitted well. There was no use trying to see in from there. She turned and ran down the long grassy slope, trying to pretend it was a palatial stairway, then around the side to the back of the barn, and there at last she found a door part way ajar. opening into what must have been the cow stables, and she slipped joyously in. Some good angel must have been protecting her in her ignorance and innocence, for that dark basement of the barn would have been an excellent hiding place for a whole regiment of tramps. But she trod safely on her way, and found nothing but a field mouse to dispute her entrance, and it scurried hastily under the foundation and disappeared. The cow stables evidently had not been occupied for a number of years, for the place was clean and littered with dry straw, as if it had fallen and sifted from the floor above. The stalls were all empty now, and old farm implements, several ploughs, and a rickety wagon occupied the dusty, cobwebby spaces beyond the stalls. There were several openings, rude doorways and crude windows, and the place was not unpleasant, for the back of it opened directly upon a sloping hill, which dropped away to the running brook below, and a little stone spring house, its mossy roof half hidden by a tangle of willows. Shirley stood in a doorway and gazed with delight, then turned back to her investigation. This lower place would not do for human habitation, of course. It was too low and damp, and the floor was only mud. She must penetrate, if possible, to the floor above. Presently she found a rough ladder, cleats nailed to uprights against the walls, and up this she crept cautiously to the opening above, and presently emerged into the wide floor of the real barn. There were several small windows left open, and the sweet spring air swept gently in. There were little patches of pale sunshine in the misty recesses of the great dim room. Gentle motes floated in the sharp lances of sunshine that stole through the cracks. Another ladder rose in the middle of the great floor to the loft above, and festoons of ancient hay and cobwebs hung dustily down from the opening above. After Shirley had skipped about the big floor and investigated in every corner of it, imagining how grand it would be to set the table in one end of the room and put Mother's bed behind a screen in the other end, with the old piano somewhere in the center, and the big parlor chair, mended, nearby, the old couch covered with a lovely throw standing on the other side. She turned her attention to the loft and, gathering courage, climbed up there. There were two great openings that let in the light, but they seemed like tiny mouse holes in the great place, and the hay lay sweet and dim, thinly scattered over the whole big floor. In one corner there was quite a luxurious lot of it, and Shirley cast herself down upon it for a blessed minute, and looked up to the dark rafters, lit with beams of sunshine creeping through fantastic cracks here and there, and wondered how the boys would enjoy sleeping up here, though there was plenty of room downstairs for a dozen sleeping rooms for the matter of that. Foolish, of course, and utterly impossible, as all daydreams always had been, but somehow it seemed so real and beautiful that she could scarcely bring herself to abandon it. Nevertheless, her investigation had made her hungry, and she decided at last to go down and eat her lunch under the big tree out in the sunshine, for it was dark and stuffy inside, although one could realize how beautiful it would be with those two great doors flung wide, and light and air let in. The day was perfect, and Shirley found a beautiful place to sit, high and sheltered, where she would not be noticed when the trolley cars sped by. And, as she ate her sandwiches, she let her imagination build a beautiful piazza where the grassy rise came up to the front of the barn, and saw in thought her mother sitting with the children at the door. How grand it would be to live in a home like this, even if it were a barn. If they could just get out here for the summer, it would do wonders for them all, and put new heart into her mother for the hard work of the winter. Perhaps by fall, Mother would be well enough to keep boarders as she longed to do, and so help out with the finances more. Well, of course, this was just one of her wild schemes, and she must not think any more about it, much less even speak of it at home, for they would never get done laughing and teasing her for it. She finished the last crumb of the piece of the 1-egg cake that Carol had made the day before for her lunch, and ran down to the spring to see whether she could get a drink, for she was very thirsty. There proved to be an old tin can on the stones in the spring house, doubtless used by the last tramp or conductor who came that way. But Shirley scrubbed it carefully in the sand, drank a delicious draught, and washed her hands and face in the clear cold water. Then she went back to the barn again, for a new thought had entered her mind. Supposing it were possible to rent that place for the summer at any reasonable price, how could they cook and how keep warm? Of course, there were such things as candles and oil lamps for lighting, but cooking? Would they have to build a fire out of doors and play at camping? Or would they have to resort to oil stoves? Oil stoves with their sticky, oily outsides and their mysterious moods of smoke and silkiness, out of which only an expert could coax them. But though she stood on all sides of that barn and gazed up at the roof, and though she searched each floor diligently, she could find no sign of a chimney anywhere. Her former acquaintance with barns had not put her into a position to judge whether this was a customary lack of barns or not. There were 2 wooden chimney-like structures decorating the roof, but it was all too evident that they were solely for purposes of ornament. Her heart sank. What a great fireplace there might have been right in the middle of the great wall opposite the door. Could anything be more ideal? She could fancy Mother sitting in front of it, with Harley and Doris on the floor playing with a kitten. But there was no fireplace. She wondered vaguely whether a stovepipe could be put out of the window, and so make possible a fire in a small cook stove. She was sure she had seen stovepipes coming out of all sorts of odd places in the cities, but would the owners allow it? And would any fire at all perhaps make it dangerous and affect the fire insurance? Oh, there were so many things to think about, and it was all so impossible, of course. She turned with heavy heart and let herself down the ladder. It was time she went home, for the afternoon was well on its way. She could hear the whir of the trolley car going up. She must be out and down the road a little way to get the next one that passed it at the switch when it came back. So with a wistful glance about the big dusty floor, she turned away and went down to the ground floor and out into the afternoon sunshine. Just as she crossed the knoll and was stepping over the broken fence, she saw a clump of clover, and among the tiny stems, one bearing 4 leaves. She was not superstitious, nor did the clover mean any special omen to her, but she stooped, smiling, and plucked it, tucking it into the buttonhole of her coat, and hurried down the road, for she could already hear the returning trolley car, and she wished to be a little farther from the barn before it overtook her. Somehow she shrank from having people in the car know where she had been, for it seemed like exposing her audacious wish to the world. Seated in the car, she turned her eyes back to the last glimpse of the stone gables and the sweeping branches of the budding tree as the car sped down the hill and curved away behind another slope. After all, it was but 4:30 when the car reached the city hall. Its route lay on 1/2 mile nearer to the little brick house, and she could stay in it and have a shorter walk if she chose. It was not in the least likely anybody would be in any office at this hour of the day anyway. That is, anybody with authority. But somehow Shirley had to signal that car and get out, long walk or not. A strong desire seized her to put her fate to the test, and either crush out this dream of hers forever, or find out at once whether it had a foundation to live. She walked straight to the Ward Trust building and searched the bulletin board in the front hallway carefully. Yes, there it was. Graham Walter, 4th floor front. With rapidly beating heart, she entered the elevator and tried to steady her voice as she said, "4th," but it shook in spite of her. What was she doing? How dared she? What should she say when they asked her what she wanted? But Shirley's firm little lips were set, and her head had that tilt that her mother knew meant business. She had gone so far she would see the matter to the finish, even if it was ridiculous. For now that she was actually on the elevator, and almost to the 4th floor, it seemed the most extraordinary thing in the world for a girl to enter a great business office and demand that its head should stoop to rent her an old barn out in the country for the infinitesimal sum that she could offer. He would perhaps think her crazy and have her put out. But she got out of the elevator calmly and walked down the hall to where a ground glass door proclaimed in gold letters the name she was hunting. Timidly she turned the knob and entered a large room, spacious and high-ceilinged, with Turkish rugs on the inlaid floor, leather chairs, and mahogany desks. There was no one in the office but a small office boy, who lolled idly on one elbow on the table, reading the funny page of the afternoon paper. She paused, half frightened, and looked about her appealingly. And now she began to be afraid she was too late. It had taken longer than she had thought it would to get here. It was almost 5:15 by the big clock on the wall. No head of a business firm was likely to stay in his office so late in the day as that, she knew. Yet she could hear the steady click of typewriter keys in an inner office. He might have remained to dictate a letter. The office boy looked up insolently. "Is Mr. Graham in?" asked Shirley. "Which Mr. Graham?" "Why," hesitating and catching the name on the door, "Mr. Walter Graham." "No, he isn't here. Never here after 4 o'clock. The boy dropped on his elbow again and resumed his reading. "Oh," said Shirley, dismayed now, in spite of her fright, as she saw all hope fading from her. "Well, is there another? Is the other Mr. Graham in?" Someone stirred in the inner office and came across to the door, looking out. Someone with an overcoat and hat on. He looked at the girl, and then spoke sharply to the boy, who stood up straight as if he had been shot. "Edward, see what the lady wants." "Yes, sir," said Edward with sudden respect. Shirley caught her breath and plunged in. "I would like to see some Mr. Graham, if possible, for just a moment." There was something self-possessed and businesslike in her voice now that commanded the boy's attention. Her brief business training was upon her. The figure from the inner room emerged and took off his hat. He was a young man and strikingly handsome, with heavy dark hair that waved over his forehead and fine strong features. His eyes were both keen and kind. There was something luminous in them that made Shirley think of Doris's eyes when she asked a question. Doris had wonderfully wise eyes. "I am Mr. Sidney Graham," said the young man, advancing. "What can I do for you?" "Oh, I wanted to ask you about a barn," began Shirley eagerly, then stopped abashed. How could she ask this immaculate son of luxury if he would rent a young girl his barn to live in during the summer? She could feel the color mounting in her cheeks and would have turned and fled gladly if there had been a way open. She was aware not only of the kind eyes of the man upon her, but also of the gaping boy taking it all in, and her tongue was suddenly tied. She could say no more. But the young man saw how it was, and he bowed as gracefully as if asking about barns was a common habit of young women coming into his office. "Oh, certainly," he said. "Won't you just step in here a moment and sit down? We can talk better. Edward, you may go. I shall not need you any longer this evening." "But I am detaining you. You were just going out," cried Shirley in a panic. "I will go away now and come again, perhaps." She would do anything to get away without telling her preposterous errand. "Not at all," said young Mr. Graham. "I am in no hurry whatsoever. Just step this way and sit down." His tone was kindness itself. Somehow, Shirley had to follow him. Her face was crimson now, and she felt ready to cry. What a fool she had been to get herself into a predicament like this. What would her mother say to her? How could she tell this strange young man what she had come for? But he was seated and looking at her with his nice eyes, taking in all the little pitiful attempts at neatness and style and beauty in her shabby little toilette. She was awfully conscious of a loose fluff of gold-tinted hair that had come down over one hot cheek and ear. How disheveled she must look, and how dusty, after climbing over that dirty barn. And then she plunged into her subject. Chapter 3. "I'm sure I don't know what you'll think of my asking," said Shirley excitedly, "but I want very much to know whether there is any possibility that you would rent a beautiful big stone barn you own out on the old Glenside Road, near Allister Avenue. You do own it, don't you? I was told you did, or at least that Mr. Walter Graham did. They said it belonged to the estate." "Well, now you've got one on me," said the young man with a most engaging smile. "I'm sure I don't know whether I own it or not. I'm sorry. But if it belongs to grandfather's estate, his name was Walter too, you know, why, I suppose I do own part of it. I'm sorry father isn't here. He, of course, knows all about it, or the attorney, of course he would know, but I think he has left the office. However, that doesn't matter. What was it you wanted? To rent it, you say?" "Yes," said Shirley, feeling very small and very much an impostor. "That is, if I could afford it. I suppose perhaps it will be way ahead of my means, but I thought it wouldn't do any harm to ask." Her shy eyes were almost filled with tears, and the young man was deeply distressed. "No, not at all, not at all," he hastened to say. "I'm just stupid that I don't know about it. Where did you say it was? Out on the Glenside Road? A barn? Come to think of it, I remember one of my uncles lived out that way once, and I know there is a lot of land somewhere out there belonging to the estate. You say there's a barn on it?" "Yes, a beautiful barn," said Shirley anxiously, her eyes dreamy and her cheeks like two glowing roses. "It is stone, and has a wide grassy road like a great staircase leading up to it, and a tall tree over it. There's a brook just below. It's high up from the road on a little grassy hill." "Oh, yes, yes," he said, nodding eagerly. "I see. It almost seems as if I remember. And you wanted to rent it for the summer, you say? You are, in the agricultural business, I suppose?" He looked at her respectfully. He knew the new woman and honored her. He did not seem at all startled that she wanted to rent a barn for the summer. But Shirley did not in the least understand. She looked at him bewildered a moment. "Oh, no, I'm only a stenographer myself, but my mother, that is—" She paused in confusion. "Oh, I see, your mother is the farmer, I suppose. Your home is nearby? Near to the barn you want to rent?" Then she understood. "Oh, no, no," she said desperately. "We don't want to use the barn for a barn at all. I want to use it for a house." It was out at last, the horrible truth, and she sat trembling to see his look of amazement. "Use it for a house?" he exclaimed. "Why, how could you? To live in, do you mean? Or just to take a tent and camp out there for a few days?" "To live in," said Shirley doggedly, lifting her eyes in one swift, defiant look, and then dropping them to her shabby gloves and thin pocketbook, empty now even of the last precious nickel. If he said anything more, she was sure she should cry. If he patronized her the least little bit, or grew haughty now that he saw how low she was reduced, she would turn and fly from the office and never look him in the face. But he did neither. Instead, he just talked in a natural tone, as if it were the most common thing in the world for a girl to want to live in a barn, and nothing to be surprised over in the least. "Oh, I see," he said pleasantly. "Well, now that might be arranged, you know. Of course, I don't know much about things, but I could find out. You see, I don't suppose we often have calls to rent the property that way." "No, of course not," said Shirley, gathering up her scattered confidence. "I know it's queer of me to ask, but we have to move. They're going to build an apartment house where we're renting now, and Mother is sick. I should like to get her out into the country. Our house is so little and dark, and I thought if she could be all summer where she could see the sky and hear the birds, she might get well. I want to get my little sisters and brothers out of the city too, but we couldn't likely pay enough rent. I suppose it was silly of me to ask." "Not at all," said the young man courteously, as though she had been a queen whom he delighted to honor. "I don't see why we shouldn't be able to get together on some kind of a proposition. That is, unless Father has other plans that I don't know about. A barn ought not to be worth such a big price. How much would you feel like paying?" He was studying the girl before him with interested eyes, noting the well-set head on the pretty shoulders. Even in spite of the ill-fitting shabby blue coat, the delicate features, the glint of gold in the soft brown hair, the tilt of the firm little chin, and the wistfulness in those big blue eyes, this was a new kind of girl, and he was disposed to give her what she wanted, if he could. And he could! He knew well that anything he willed mightily would not be denied him. The frightened color came into the delicate cheeks again, and the blue eyes fluttered down ashamedly. "We are only paying $15 a month now," she said, "and I couldn't pay any more, for we haven't got it. I couldn't pay as much, for it would cost 60 cents a week apiece for George and me to come into our work from there. I couldn't pay more than 12, and I know that's ridiculous for such a great, big, beautiful place, but I had to ask." She lifted her eyes swiftly in apology and dropped them again. The young man felt a glow of sympathy for her and a deep desire to help her have her wish. "Why, certainly," he said heartily. "Of course you did. And it's not ridiculous at all for you to make a business proposition of any kind. You say what you can do, and we'll accept it. Or not, as we like. That's our lookout. Now, of course, I can't answer about this until I've consulted Father. And not knowing the place well, I haven't the least idea what it's worth. It may not even be worth $12. He made a mental reservation that it should not be if he could help it. Suppose I consult with Father and let you know. Could I write or phone you? Or will you be around this way any time tomorrow?" Shirley's breath was fairly gone with the realization that he was actually considering her proposition in earnest. He had not laughed at her for wanting to live in a barn, and he had not turned down the price she offered as impossible. He was looking at her in a kindly way, as if he liked her for being frank. "Why, yes," she said, looking up shyly. "I can come in tomorrow at my noon hour. If that would not be too soon. I always have a little time to myself then, and it isn't far from the office." "That will be perfectly all right for me," smiled young Graham. "I shall be here till 1:30, and you can ask the boy to show you to my office. I will consult with Father the first thing in the morning, and be ready to give you an answer. But I am wondering if you have seen this barn. I suppose you have, or you would not want to rent it. But I should suppose a barn would be an awfully unpleasant place to live. Kind of almost impossible. Are you sure you realize what the proposition would be?" "Yes, I think so," said Shirley, looking troubled and earnest. "It is a beautiful big place, and the outlook is wonderful. I was there today and found an open door at the back, and went in to look around. The upstairs middle floor is so big we could make several rooms out of it, with screens and curtains. It would be lovely. We could live in a picnic style. Yes, I'm sure Mother would like it. I haven't told her about it yet, because if I couldn't afford it, I didn't want to disappoint her. So I thought I would wait until I found out. But I'm just about certain she would be delighted. And anyhow, we've got to go somewhere." "I see," said this courteous young man, trying not to show his amazement and delight in the girl who so coolly discussed living in a barn with curtains and screens for partitions. He thought of his own luxurious home and his comfortable life, where every need had been supplied even before he realized it, and, wondering again, was refreshed in soul by this glimpse into the brave heart of the girl. "Then I will expect you," he said pleasantly, and opening the door, escorted her to the elevator, touching his hat to her as he left her. Shirley would not have been a normal girl if she had not felt the least flutter in her heart at the attention he showed her and the pleasant tones of his voice. It was for all the world as if she had been a lady, dressed in broadcloth and fur. She looked down at her shabby little serge suit that had done duty all winter with an old gray sweater under it, half in shame and half in pride in the man who had not let it hinder him from giving her honor. He was a man. He must be. She had bared her poverty-stricken life to his gaze, and he had not taken advantage of it. He had averted his eyes and acted as if it were just like others' lives and others' necessities, and he had made her feel that she was just as good as anyone with whom he had to deal. Well, it was probably only a manner, a kind of refined, courteous habit he had, but it was lovely, and she was going to enjoy the bit of it that had fallen at her feet. On the whole, Shirley walked the 10 blocks to her narrow little home, feeling that she had had a good day. She was weary, but it was a healthy weariness. The problem which had been pressing on her brain for days and nights, too, did not seem so impossible now, and hope was in her heart that somehow she would find a way out. It had been good to get away from the office and the busy monotony, and go into the wide open out of doors. It was good also to meet a real nobleman, even if it were only in passing and on business. She decided not to tell her mother and the children of her outing yet, not until she was sure there were to be results. Besides, it might only worry her mother the more and give her a sleepless night if she let out the secret about the barn. One more little touch of pleasantness there came to make this day stand out from others as beautiful. It was when she turned into Chapel Street and was swinging along rapidly in order to get home at her usual time and not alarm her mother, that a car rolled quickly past the middle of the block and stopped just under a streetlight. In a moment more, a lady came out of the door of a house, entered the car, and was driven away. As she closed the car door, Shirley fancied she saw something drop from the lady's hand. When she reached the place, she found it was 2 great, luscious pink rosebuds that must have slipped from the lady's corsage and fallen on the pavement. Shirley picked them up almost reverently, inhaling their exotic breath and taking in their delicate curves and textures. Then she looked after the limousine. It was 3 blocks away and just turning into another street. It would be impossible for her to overtake it, and there was little likelihood of the lady's returning for 2 roses. Probably she would never miss them. Shirley turned toward the house, thinking she ought to take them in, but discovered that it bore the name of a fashionable dress designer, who would, of course, not have any right to the roses, and Shirley's conscience decided they were meant by Providence for her. So happily she hurried on to the little brick house, bearing the wonderful flowers to her mother. She hurried so fast that she reached home 10 minutes earlier than usual, and they all gathered around her eagerly as if it were some great event, Mother calling half fearfully from her bedroom upstairs to know whether anything had happened. She was always expecting some new calamity, like sickness or the loss of their positions, by one or the other of her children. "Nothing at all the matter, Mother dear," called Shirley happily as she hung up her coat and hat and hugged Doris. "I just got off earlier than usual, because Mr. Bernard had to go away. Just see what a beautiful thing I have brought you. I found it on the street, dropped by a beautiful lady. You needn't be afraid of them, for she and her limousine looked perfectly hygienic, and it wasn't stealing, because I couldn't possibly have caught her. Aren't they lovely?" By this time she was up in her mother's room, with Doris and Carol following close behind, exclaiming in delight over the roses. She kissed her mother and put the flowers into a glass beside the bed. "You're looking better tonight, I believe, dear," said the mother. "I've been worried about you all day. You were so white and tired this morning." "Oh, I'm feeling fine, mother dear," said Shirley gaily, "and I'm going down to make your toast and poach you an egg while Carol finishes getting supper. George will be here in 10 minutes now, and Harley ought to be in any minute. He always comes when he gets hungry. My, I'm hungry myself. Let's hurry, Carol. Doris, darling, can you fix Mother's little table all ready for her tray? Put on the white cloth. Take away the books. Set the glass with the roses in the middle very carefully. You won't spill it, will you, darling?" Doris, all smiles at the responsibility accorded her, promised, "No, I won't spill it. I'll move it carefully." There was something in Shirley's buoyant air that night that lifted them all above the cares that had oppressed them for weeks and gave them new hope. She flew around, getting the supper things together, making her mother's tray pretty, and taking little extra pains for each one, as she had not felt able to do before. Carol caught the contagion and mashed the potatoes more carefully so that there wasn't a single lump in them. "Goodness, but it's been hot in this kitchen all day, Shirley," said Carol. "I had the back door open, but it just seemed stifling. I got the ironing all done except a tablecloth, and I guess I can finish that this evening. I haven't got much studying to do for tomorrow. Nellie Waite stopped and left me my books. I don't believe I'll have to stay at home another day this week. Mother says she can get along. I can leave her lunch all ready, and Doris can manage." Shirley's conscience gave a sudden twinge. Here she had been sitting under a lovely tree by a brook, eating her lunch and dreaming foolish daydreams about living in a barn, while Carol stayed at home from school and toiled in the kitchen. Perhaps she ought to have come home and sent Carol back to school, and yet perhaps that nice young Mr. Graham would be able to do something. She would not condemn herself until the morrow anyway. She had tried to do her best. She had not gone off there selfishly just to have a good time by herself when her dear ones were suffering. It had been for their sake. Then George came in whistling, and Harley banged in a minute later, calling to know whether supper was ready. "'Cause I got a date with the fellers this evening, and I gotta beat it," he declared impatiently. The shadow of anxiety passed over Shirley's face again at that, but she quieted her heart once more with her hopes for tomorrow. If her plans succeeded, Harley would be away from the fellows and wouldn't have so many questionable dates to worry them all. George was in a hurry, too. "Gee, Shirley, I gotta be at the store all evening," he said, bolting his food hurriedly. "I wouldn't have come home, only I knew you'd worry, and Mother gets so upset." "Gee, Shirley, what are we going to do about a house? It's getting almost time to move. I went to all those places you suggested at noon today, but there wasn't a vacant spot anywhere. There's some rooms on Loudon Street, but there's all sorts in the house. Mother wouldn't like it. It's dirty besides. I suppose if we took long enough we could find rooms, but we'd have to get along with only 2 or 3, for they come awful high. We'd have to have 3 anyway, you girls and Mother in one, us boys in the other, and one for parlor and kitchen together. Gee, wouldn't that be fierce? I ought to get a better job. We can't live that way." "Don't worry, George. I think we'll find something better," said Shirley, with a hopeful ring in her voice. "I've been thinking out a plan. I haven't got it all just arranged in my mind yet, but I'll tell you about it pretty soon. You don't have school tomorrow night, do you? No, I thought not. Well, maybe we can talk it over then. You and I will have to go out together and look up a place, perhaps." And she smiled an encouraging smile, and sent him off to school happily. She extracted a promise from Harley that he would be in by 9 o'clock, discovered that he was only going to a movie show around the corner with one of the fellows who was going to stand treat on account of a wonderful ball game they had won, found out where his lessons were for the morrow, promised to help him when he returned, and sent him away with a feeling of comfort and responsibility to return early. She washed the dishes and ironed the tablecloth so Carol could go to her lessons. Then she went up and put Doris to bed with a story about a little bird that built a nest in a tall, beautiful tree that grew beside the place where the little girl lived. A little bird that drank from a little running brook and took a bath on its pebbly shore, and ate the crumbs and berries the little girl gave it, and sat all day on 5 little blue eggs. Harley came in at 5 minutes after 9 and did his lessons with her help. George came home just as they finished. He was whistling, though he looked tired. He said the professor had been the limit all the evening. Shirley fixed her mother comfortably for the night, and went at last to her own bed, more tired than she had been for weeks, and yet more happy. For through it all she had been sustained by a hope, inspired by a cultured, pleasant voice, and eyes that wanted to help, and seemed to understand. As she closed her eyes to sleep, somehow that pleasant voice and those kind eyes mingled with her dreams, and seemed to promise relief from her great anxieties. It was with a feeling of excitement and anticipation that she dressed the next morning and hurried away. Something was coming, she felt sure, some help for their trying situation. She had felt it when she had knelt for her usual prayer that morning, and it throbbed in her excited heart as she hurried through the streets to the office. It almost frightened her to feel so sure, for she knew how terrible would be the disappointment if she got her hopes up too high. There was plenty to be done at the office, a great many letters to answer, and a telegram with directions from Mr. Barnard. But she worked with more ease than for some time, and was done by 11:30. When she took the letters out to Mr. Clegg to be signed, he told her that she would not be needed the rest of the day, and might go at once if she chose. She ate her bit of lunch hurriedly, and made herself as fresh and tidy as was possible in the office. Then she took her way to the 4th floor of the Ward Trust Building. With throbbing heart and glowing cheeks, she entered the office of Walter Graham, and asked for Mr. Sidney Graham. The office boy had evidently received instructions, for he bowed most respectfully this time, and led her at once to the inner office. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to the Enchanted Barn. Please let me know how you like this story, and make suggestions for others you'd like to hear. I'll talk to you again soon.